Hey guys, so it's been a while since we've had a video, so I thought why not give you guys a new video. We are now turning our focus on to cell division. I personally think that this is a lot more interesting and a less stressful than photosynthesis and cellular respiration. So you can take a little bit of a breather. I find this more interesting because this is a lot more relatable to our everyday lives. In the fact that we see the big picture with cell division. And so I hope that you maybe find this part of biology a little more interesting than previous chapters. I realize that this is very stressful, but we are going to take this slow like we usually do, and we are going to be applying a lot of this to everyday situations. After this video, you should be able to contrast cell division in prokaryotes and eukaryotes, identify the phases of the eukaryotic cell cycle, explain how the cell cycle is controlled, and finally define cancer and relate it to the cell cycle. So again, we are now looking at something and we're looking at a bigger picture. We're not just looking at two chemical equations that happen and the little the little details of it. Yes, we're going to focus on details in this especially when we talk about mitosis. There are a lot of details that go into that. So I'm not going to say it's easier. I'm just going to say it's a little more relatable because we're looking at a lot of things that we're going to relate to are cancer. So if you do have any issues with that beforehand, please talk to me, and so we can kind of get you a different kind of example if that's a very difficult situation for you, which I understand. A lot of people around this area, unfortunately, are affected by cancer and our families. Another thing I did want to point out in this video, I don't have as many notes. I'm finding that when you're stressing about writing so many notes, you don't really listen to the videos, or maybe you just don't want to listen at all, whatever. That's on you. It's your grade. But I am trying to write less notes and talk more in the video to help you listen more and to not feel like a hand cramp, because that's really inconvenient for one, and to not have to pause the video so much. So I am going to try and shorten these videos. There is no guarantee because for some reason I really like to talk, I guess. All right, surprise. You are made up of so many cells, like trillions of cells. I know that may seem shocking, but you are not a single-celled organism. I know that's crazy to think. But remember, your cells are made up of different types of organelles. So especially eukaryotes, and we are a eukaryote because we are an animal, we are a lot more complex, but we do have things like the nucleus, the Golgi apparatus, endoplasmic reticulum. All of these types of organelles are in our cells. And so these cells, they continuously multiply and divide to create new cells. And so believe it or not, at one point in your life, you were just one single cell. And you weren't that single cell forever, but at one point you were just one cell. When the sperm met the egg, they formed together and they created one cell. After some time, your cell begins to grow and grow and grow, and you eventually develop into an organism with trillions of cells. And the answer to this and why this occurs is known as cell division. So after cells grow to their max size, they eventually divide. So they get too big, and then they divide into two new cells. These new cells are small at first, and then they eventually start growing, and then those two cells produce and grow along with that. So what is cell division? Cell division is a process in which one cell, called the parent cell, divides to form two new cells, referred to as daughter cells. And like I said, how this happens depends on the type of organism we're dealing with, but it also happens by cell division. Everything we're talking about now is all based off cell division, but the type of cell determines how that cell division occurs. Remember, there are two types of cells, a prokaryote and a eukaryote. The big thing you should remember, prokaryotes are very simple, eukaryotes, not so much. In prokaryotes, you're going to find that in prokaryotes, you're going to find that they divide by what's known as binary fission. And this occurs in a series of steps. Please don't be confused though, because just because it's a series of steps that I'm giving you does not mean it's not a continuous process. So it's continuously occurring and occurring and occurring. These three steps make up binary fission. DNA replication, meaning DNA is copied and replicated. This results in two identical chromosomes instead of just one. So now you're going to have, remember, everything has a chromosome. Maybe this is not something you do remember, and that's okay. But everything has chromosomes that hold your DNA. And that DNA is what's copied in DNA replication. So this is a necessary step so that when the cell divides, each daughter cell will have its own chromosome. So we go from 1 to 2. And then eventually those two DNAs will go into two different cells. The next step in binary fission is called chromosome segregation. So if you know the word segregation, it means to separate. So what's going to happen is these two chromosomes that were formed in DNA replication are going to separate and move to opposite ends of the cell. You'll also typically hear known as poles. So opposite ends are the poles. So you're going to have both chromosomes are going to move to opposite ends. This occurs as each copy of DNA attaches to different parts of the cell membrane. So again, all I'm telling you is DNA replicates, so it's copied. You now have two. Those two are going to be separated and go to opposite ends of that cell. From there, we have what's known as separation. And if you know anything about separation, it means to pull apart. So a new plasma membrane starts growing into the center of the cell, and the cytoplasm splits apart, forming two daughter cells. As the cell begins to pull apart, the new and the original chromosomes are separated. The two daughter cells that result are genetically identical to each other and to the parent cell. So there is nothing different about the cells. The mother and the daughter are exactly the same. This is a very common practice with very simple cells, such as prokaryotes, like bacteria. Now, you're going to see some eukaryotes that do this. Those would be like your single-celled eukaryotes, like amoeba, paramecium, things like that. But typically, this is done with bacteria. And another thing you should note is this is an asexual reproduction, meaning that there is no partner needed for this kind of process. This all happens by itself. So very, very beneficial in survival for a simple organism. This is why they can grow so fast. Bacteria growth happens very rapidly due to this binary fission. Now, the next type of cell division is in eukaryotes. So these are a lot more complex, and there are a lot more things that occur within this type of organism. There are a few steps that occur. The first step is known as interphase, and we are going to go into not full detail. I will talk about more detail in class, but we're going to go over it briefly in this video. The next is mitosis. Mitosis will not be discussed in full detail in this video because it is its own animal, and we will deal with it in the next video you watch. And then finally, you have what's known as cytokinesis. So 3 parts that make up cell division in eukaryotes. I really like this picture because it really does a good job at showing the life cycle of a eukaryotic cell. So if you notice, one of the big things you might notice already is that this portion here, it takes up the chunk of that cycle. So most of the time that a cell spends is in what's known as interphase. So about 90% of a cell's life is in interphase. During interphase, the cell grows, it performs routine life processes, and it also prepares for division. This is a huge checkpoint for the cell. It checks to see if the cell's healthy and ready to go, and then it proceeds into mitosis. So mitosis is made up of these processes. I don't really want to include cytokinesis there, but prophase, metaphase, anaphase, and telophase make up mitosis. And so if you want to think of PMAT, that is the way that I always remember it. PMAT will help you remember mitosis. Interphase, it's kind of easy to remember. It's made up of G1, S, and G2. These are your checkpoints. And then finally, we go to cytokinesis, which is that cutting phase or that splitting phase. So we're going to talk about interphase in this video. Again, we will talk about mitosis and cytokinesis in the next video. All right, so what is interphase? There are not very many notes here. You will be adding notes in class. We will be talking about this in a little bit more detail. So please don't think that this is just this simple. There's a little bit more to it, but I don't want you writing a whole bunch anymore. Again, interphase is made up of 3 total phases. And really what interphase is it's just that checkpoint. It's that check to make sure, it's a security gate to make sure that the cell is doing what it's supposed to and it's clear to go to the next stage and it looks good, it's ready to go. It's like when you're going out with somebody and you check yourself in the mirror 3 times before you go out. This is the cell's way of checking itself in the mirror. Okay, so for example, you're doing your hair. You check your hair, it looks good. You go downstairs, you check your hair again in the hallway mirror to make sure. And then you probably ask your mom, oh, how do I look? Do I look good? 3 checkpoints there. That's the exact same way that the cell does. So there are 3 phases. You need to know these. The first phase is known as the growth phase, also known as G1. During this phase, the cell grows rapidly, performs routine processes. It also makes proteins needed for DNA replication and copies some of its organelles in preparation for cell division. So we're just preparing things. The cell is just kind of at this really nice la-di-da stage. It's spending most of its life in this phase. It's just kind of going through the motions. Then we have what's known as the S phase, or what's known synthesis phase. And during this phase, the cell's DNA is copied in the process of DNA replication. We will get into DNA replication in huge detail. So don't think it's just that, because there's a little more. And that's kind of sucks. The final phase in interphase is known as growth phase, G2. During this phase, the cell makes final preparations to divide. So there are two phases where we're growing. But the first one, remember, that's where we're spending most of our time. This is where just traditional, typical things are occurring. In the second phase, what differs there is that these are the final preparations. It makes additional proteins and organelles. So this is like DNA has been copied, it's ready to go. And then in that growth phase, we're like, oh, we just need a couple more proteins. Let's go ahead and add those in there. All right. And so that's interphase. And really, like I said, it's a huge checkpoint to make sure that the cell cycle is doing what it's supposed to before mitosis occurs. Because before mitosis occurs, you need to have your DNA replicated. If your DNA replicated is mutated or it's messed up, interphase comes in and it says, hey, nope, not even happening. You're not going to divide when you have this messed up DNA. Not letting you go through. Now, there is an issue that can occur if the cell cycle is not controlled. But before we talk about that, let's talk about how it's controlled. The cell cycle is controlled by regulatory proteins. And what these proteins are is they just tell the cell when to stop and start a phase. So if it feels like a phase is not complete, the cell halts and it completes that entire phase until it's ready, and then it moves on. And there are a number of places where these regulatory proteins are found. There are three particular places I want you to know about. First place where you're going to find regulatory proteins is in the cell growth checkpoint. Second place is the DNA synthesis checkpoint. And then the third place is actually in mitosis. So in mitosis, it's going to occur within metaphase, or the M phase. So three huge checkpoints. Like I said, the first two are found in interphase. This is a huge place, and generally things are stopped. A lot of times cells will go through apoptosis before they even mutate or multiply or divide. All right, like I said, when things go wrong, cancer occurs when the cell cycle is no longer regulated. I didn't mean to put not. It's supposed to say no longer regulated. And this can happen due to a number of things. A big reason why cancer occurs is because of mutated DNA. So if you're mutating DNA and something's just not right with that DNA and the cell can't check on that, that's a huge reason. Another one is exposure to radiation or toxic chemicals. So if you've ever, like Hiroshima, and people that were exposed to nuclear disasters, that they are a high risk for cancer. People that deal with toxic chemicals a lot, you'll see that they wear these huge body suits. That's not just to have for their job, that's to protect them from toxic, deadly things that could really hurt them and cause cancer. Like I said, radiation. So yes, radiation is used great to get rid of cancer, but it can also be a reason why people do get cancer. There are different forms of radiation, and you'll learn about that next year when you get into chemistry. But you should know that exposure to hazardous materials can cause cancer just as much as your DNA. In cancerous cells, the crazy thing about them is that they generally divide much faster than normal cells, because a lot of times those checkpoints within interphase, the growth phases and the synthesis phase, are not regulated. So there's no regulatory proteins telling this cell to stop growing or to stop. It just keeps going and it keeps going. So they're growing super fast. They may eventually form a mass of abnormal cells called a tumor. Now, not all tumors are cancerous, but and we will talk about that in class, but a lot of them are. So the rapidly dividing cells, what they are doing is they're taking nutrients and space from normal cells. And what happens is those normal cells eventually start to die and the tumor takes over, and this damages tissues and organs, and eventually that could lead to death if not taken care of right away. So I don't really mean to end on a morbid note, but that is how the cell cycle is directly related to cancer. And that's a big thing. I mean, we are all affected by cancer in some way. We have family, we have friends, we know somebody that has or is affected by cancer. And so I really think that this may be a better chapter for us to be able to relate to different things. If you have any questions, please ask me on Edpuzzle.